Petróleo Brasileiro S.A. Petrobras, more commonly known as simply Petrobras, is a semi-public Brazilian multinational corporation in the petroleum industry headquartered in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The company's name translates to Brazilian Petroleum Corporation, Petrobras. The company was ranked number 58 in the most recent Fortune Global 500 list. Current operations. Business areas. The company operates in 6 business areas listed in order of revenues: refining, transportation and marketing, refining, logistics, transportation, trading operations, oil products and crude oil exports and imports, and petrochemical investments in Brazil, exploration and production, crude oil, NGL and natural gas exploration, development and production in Brazil, distribution of oil products, ethanol, biodiesel and natural gas to wholesalers and through the Petrobras Distribuidora S.A. retail network in Brazil, gas and power, transportation and trading of natural gas and LNG, and generation and trading of electric power, and the fertilizer business, international exploration and production of oil and gas, refining, transportation and marketing, distribution and gas and power operations outside of Brazil, biofuels, production of biodiesel and its co-products and ethanol-related activities such as equity investments, production and trading of ethanol, sugar and the excess electricity generated from sugarcane bagasse. Production and reserves. Petrobras controls significant oil and energy assets in 16 countries in Africa, North America, South America, Europe, and Asia. However, Brazil represented 92% of Petrobras' worldwide production in 2014 and accounted for 97% of Petrobras' worldwide reserves on the 31st of December 2014. As of the 31st of December 2014, the company had 8,112.8 million barrels of oil equivalent of proved developed reserves and 4,599.7 million barrels of oil equivalent of proved undeveloped reserves in Brazil. Of these reserves, 62.7% were located in the offshore Campos Basin. The largest growth prospect for the company is the Lula oil field in the Santos Basin. In 2015, the company produced 2.284 million barrels of oil equivalent per day, of which 89% was petroleum and 11% was natural gas. International investments reserves held outside of Brazil accounted for 8.4% of production in 2014. The majority of these reserves are in South America. The company has assets in Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Petrobras owns refineries in Texas, Okinawa, Japan, and Bahia Blanca, Argentina. The company also owns exploration blocks in the Gulf of Mexico and through joint ventures has production in Nigeria, Benin, Gabon, and Namibia. Ownership. The Brazilian government directly owns 54% of Petrobras common shares with voting rights, while the Brazilian Development Bank and Brazil's Sovereign Wealth Fund each control 5%, bringing the state's direct and indirect ownership to 64%. The privately held shares are traded on BM and AMP-F Bovespa, where they are part of the Ibovespa index. Corporate social responsibility. Petrobras is a major supporter of the arts in Brazil. History. Petrobras was created in 1953 during the government of Brazilian President Getulio Vargas under the slogan, "The oil is ours," and was given a legal monopoly in Brazil. At the time of the founding of Petrobras in 1953, Brazil only produced 2,700 barrels of oil per day. Petrobras began processing oil shale in 1953, developing Petrobras technology for extracting oil from oil shale. An industrial-size retort began processing shale in the 1990s. In 2006, Petrobras claimed that this industrial retort had a design capacity to process 260 tons per hour of oil shale. In 1961, Petrobras geologist Walter K. Link published Link's memorandum, which implied that the company was better off exploring offshore instead of onshore. In 1961, the company's REDUC refinery commenced operations. In 1963, Petrobras discovered the Recôncavo and Carmópolis oil fields. In 1963, Petrobras created its research center CENPES in Rio de Janeiro. It remains one of the world's largest centers dedicated to energy research. In 1967, the company established its Petrobras Química S.A. subsidiary focused on petrochemicals and the conversion of naphtha into ethene. The company's growth was halted by the 1973 oil crisis. The entire country was affected, and the Brazilian miracle, a period when annual GDP growth exceeding 10% ended. Petrobras nearly went bankrupt. In 1974, the company discovered an oil field in the Campos Basin. This discovery boosted its finances and helped it restructure nationwide. In 1975, the Brazilian government temporarily allowed foreign operators in Brazil, and Petrobras signed contracts with foreign companies to explorate 4 more oil fields in Brazil. The company was also affected by the 1979 energy crisis, although it was not nearly as bad as in 1973. In 1994, Petrobras placed into service Petrobras.The, the world's largest oil platform. The platform sunk after an explosion in 2001 and was completely lost. In 1997, the government approved Law N. 9.478, which broke Petrobras's monopoly and allowed for competitors to develop Brazil's oil fields. The Brazilian government also created the National Petroleum Agency, responsible for the regulation and supervision of activities in the petroleum industry, and the National Council of Energy Policies, a public agency responsible for the development of public energy policy. Also in 1997, Petrobras reached the mark of producing 1 million barrels per day. The company also executed agreements with other Latin American governments and began operations outside of Brazil. In 1999, the National Petroleum Agency signed agreements with other companies, officially ending the company's monopoly. In 2000, Petrobras achieved a world record for oil exploration in deep waters. The exploration reached a depth of 1,877 meters below sea level. In 2002, Petrobras acquired the Argentine company Perez Companc Energia from the Perez Companc family and its foundation for $1.18 billion. This acquisition included assets in Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador. The company had 1.1 billion barrels of crude oil reserves and production of 181,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day. In 2003, on its 50-year anniversary, Petrobras surpassed 2 million barrels of oil equivalent of daily production. In 2005, Petrobras announced a joint venture with Nippon Alcohol Hanbai to sell ethanol from Brazil to Japan called Brazil.The Ethanol. On the 21st of April 2006, the company started production on the P50 oil platform in the Albacora East field at Campos Basin, which gave Brazil self-sufficiency in oil production. On the 1st of May 2006, after the Bolivian gas conflict, Bolivia's President Evo Morales announced the nationalization of all gas and oil fields in the country and ordered the occupation of all fields by the Bolivian army. On 4 May 2006, Petrobras cancelled a major future investment plan in Bolivia as a result of the nationalization. The Bolivian government demanded an increase in the royalty payments made by foreign petroleum companies to 82%, but wound up settling for a 50% royalty interest. In 2007, Petrobras inaugurated the Petrobras 52 oil platform. The 52 is the biggest Brazilian oil platform and third in the world. In 2007 and 2008, Petrobras made several major oil discoveries including the Lula oil field, the Jupiter field, and the Sugarloaf field, all in the Santos Basin, 300 kilometers from the coast of Rio de Janeiro. The oil fields were discovered by partnerships that include Petrobras, Royal Dutch Shell, and Galp Energia. However, estimates of reserves in these new fields varied widely. In January 2009, the P-51 platform, the first semi-submersible platform built entirely in Brazil, started production in the Campos Basin. The platform is capable of producing up to 180,000 barrels of oil per day. In February 2009, China agreed to supply Petrobras with $10 billion in loans. In exchange, Petrobras agreed to supply 60,000–100,000 barrels of oil per day to a subsidiary of Sinopec and 40,000–60,000 barrels of oil per day to Petrochina. In August 2009, Petrobras acquired ExxonMobil's Esso assets in Chile for $400 million. In September 2010, the company completed a $70 billion share offering, the largest share offering in history. The funds were to be used to develop the newly discovered oil fields. In 2012, Petrobras handed back permits that it had to explore offshore New Zealand. In July 2013, a workers' strike action shut down production at several of the company's oil platforms. In September 2013, Petrobras sold 11 onshore exploration and production blocks in Colombia to Perenco for $380 million. It emerged in September 2013 that the U.S. government had been allegedly spying on Petrobras after organizer Cos Globo reported the claims on national television. The information was reportedly provided by U.S. journalist Glenn Greenwald. Petrobras announced that it was investing 21 billion reals over 5 years to improve its data security. In 2014, the company sold its assets in Peru to Petrochina for $2.6 billion. In 2014, Petrobras set a new company record for average daily production of 2.863 million barrels of oil equivalent. By November 2015, the company had accumulated $128 billion in debt, 84% of which was denominated in foreign currencies. Operation Car Wash and related protests in Brazil in 2014, the largest corruption scandal in the history of Brazil, centered around Petrobras, was uncovered. According to the investigation, a small number of top Petrobras officials colluded with an organized cartel of 16 companies to overcharge Petrobras for construction and service work, and these top officials received bribes and kickbacks. Petrobras officials have pegged the total of all bribes at nearly $3 billion. As of August 2015, 117 indictments have been issued, 5 politicians have been arrested, and criminal cases have been brought against 13 companies. Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff, who promised to reduce corruption during her election campaign, and former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, both of whom served on the board of directors of Petrobras during the scandals, have both been blamed. This has sparked protests in Brazil. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation sued Petrobras and its auditors, PricewaterhouseCoopers, as a result of the corruption scandal. Environmental record: Petrobras has noted on its website several initiatives that it has taken to preserve the environment. These include sponsoring efforts to support both ocean and forest ecosystems. Petrobras subscribes to the United Nations Global Compact, a voluntary agreement which encompasses a set of principles regarding human rights, working conditions, corruption, and the environment. In 2008, the Spanish consultancy firm Management and Excellence acknowledged Petrobras as the world's most sustainable oil company. Oil spills: Petrobras in popular culture. In the Speed Racer live-action movie, one of the cars featured is the Green Energy, a biodiesel-fueled racing car sponsored by Petrobras. Petrobras is the main sponsor of the Brazilian Serie A. Petrobras was a secondary sponsor for the Ayrton Ampty Williams F1 team from 1998 to 2008 and has signed with Williams F1 again from 2014 onwards. Petrobras was a sponsor for Flamengo in Brazil from 1984 to 2009. The sauropod dinosaur Petrobras Saurus is named after this company.